Alright, so we come at last to the most confusing part of Unreal, at least for these basic art tools, which is whenever you place a light in the world, it's going to give you three options for mobility: movable, stationary, and static. And it's really important to understand what these are, but it's really confusing. So I'm going to do my best to explain it. Um, I've put examples of each of the three here. These are all the same spotlight, same settings, same angle, but this one's a static one, this one's a stationary one, and this one's a movable one. So let's examine like the different effects. So movable is a fully dynamic light. You can move it around at runtime, which is sort of the term for like during gameplay. This is runtime because I'm running around and the game is running. So a lot of things you can't change at runtime. You can't like import new files into the game at runtime typically, unless you set something up special. You can't do stuff like that, but you can do things like, move a character around. That's a thing you can do at runtime. And a movable light can be changed in any way at runtime. You can change the color, you can change the position, angle, intensity, all of this stuff. So that's great. Downside of the movable light, it's casting a dynamic shadow that doesn't have any kind of bounce light in it. So it's basically pitch black. Doesn't look great. If we look at the stationary light, we'll see this actually does have some bounce light, so the cube isn't pitch black. That's nice. You'll also notice, I can't move this. If I move this light, it will unbuild all the lighting, and I will have to start the video over. So I'm not going to do that. But you could move it, and it would break the lighting, and it would say, lighting needs to be rebuilt, which we saw earlier. Anyway, so if you look at this, it's got a pretty smooth circle of the spotlight. And then if you look at the shadow, it's kind of chunky. It's not the right shape. Like this is a square shadow from a square cube. And this one is weird and wrong. But it's also pretty sharp in the edges. So that's something to note. And meanwhile, the static light is casting a very pixelated spotlight and a very pixelated shadow that's notably got much softer edges than the stationary light. So what is going on here? There's not really much more to explain with the movable light. It's just a dynamic light that projects itself out into the world and tries to render a shadow. That's pretty straightforward. And these are the most costly to your game's performance. And so these are things you try to avoid using in large numbers, but you can use them when you need a light that's moving around or whatever. A stationary light, interestingly, you can change the color and you can change the intensity at runtime. You can do that during gameplay. You just can't change the position. You can't do anything that would affect the shadows or the shape of the light. You can just change color and intensity. Meanwhile, the static light you can't change at all. You can't move it, and you also can't change the color. You can't change the intensity. Static light is baked into the game. It is unchangeable. So that's the difference between stationary and static in behavior. And also, you should be paying attention to the difference in the way they look, because there's a reason for that. So there's two different things that are storing light in Unreal from the stationary and static. There's something called the light map, and there's something called the shadow map. And this is the really unintuitive part. The light map is basically a bitmap image that stores in sort of a big packed puzzle looking thing every surface in the game. And it has sort of pixelated images of the shadows like this one. And the light map can store color, it can store light and dark, it can store basically anything you can store in an image. So that's the light map, and that's what static lights project themselves into. They bake directly into the light map. The shadow map is sort of like a black and white vector image. So it doesn't have pixels per se. It's like an Adobe Illustrator or a Flash image. But it does have sort of points, and it says, the shadow goes between these points, like a connect the dots kind of thing, and it fills it in. And that's why the shadow's so sharp, but it's also the wrong shape, because it's not stored accurately, but the shape it has stored, it can render pretty cleanly. and I think it also has the capability to do some like slight blur on like a spotlight or whatever. So that's the shadow map. And since the shadow map is just a shadow or not, you know, that's all the information it stores. That's why you can change the color, because it's just projecting this light into sort of the stencil of the shadow map. So everything else is malleable. Meanwhile, again, since the static image, the static light map is entirely full color, you can't just go in and change the color of the light because this has already been baked out. Hopefully that makes sense. And there's also one more part to this, which is that if you have a stationary light, it will project the light it will project the sort of main light into the shadow map. But if there's any bounce light, sort of secondary bounce light, that is going into the light map. So you can see the bounce light illuminating the cube here. And if I were to delete the stationary light, which I'm going to do because I'm an absolute madman, that bounce light is actually going to stay there, as you can see. So the cube still has the bounce light on it, even though the stationary light is now gone, because the bounce light is stored in the static light map. So why do you care about all this stuff? So as you can see, since I've fucked with the stationary light, it's now unbuilt. One good thing to know is if you have a stationary or a static light that is unbuilt like this, it's going to basically behave as and look like a movable light, except it's going to have preview stenciled in all the shadows. So that's how you know this is an unbuilt light. So now it looks exactly the same as a movable light because it is the same as a movable light. Just a nice thing to know. This sucks, so I'm going to delete it now. But anyway, so why would you use any one of these? You know, how do you choose which one is the right one? And that is complicated. But first, I'm going to talk about light map resolution, because that's the next important thing here. As you can see, this looks really pixelated and bad. And the shadow here is gone now, but as we remember, it was sort of the wrong shape. Now, if I go over to this plane, I have the same scene set up. If you look here, this is the movable light. This is the stationary one. It's already looking a lot better. And then if I fly over here, this is the static light. Still pixelated, but again, it is looking quite a bit better. And the reason for that is that the light map resolution on this mesh is much higher than the one on this one. So if we look at the mesh details panel here, I scroll down, I have set the light map resolution to 32. By default, I believe it's 64, but I turned it down to sort of exaggerate the effect here. Meanwhile, this one is set to 512, which is really high. Hang on a second. Okay, I'm back. There were some technical issues which may be continuing, but just gonna try to power through this. I set up a few new things here because we were talking about how this mesh, this plane mesh here, has a low light map resolution, and this one has a high light map resolution. So we've revealed now that meshes store light maps on them, right? Which is a new idea, I guess. So looking at these ones, which I baked a static light on, I put a static point light over these. This new floor mesh is 256, so it's sort of splitting the difference between these two. You can see still kind of gnarly, and we're getting the pixelated shadows that you get with a static light. So it's not just the floor that's getting these shadows cast on it, it's also the meshes, these pipes themselves. So if we zoom in on the inside here, we can see more of those pixelated shadows. If we look around here, we can see this is, oh, by the way, so if I go to lit in this menu here, that's the normal, correct, you know, fully rendered view of Unreal. But you can go down here, you can look at unlit, which is just sort of the color maps. You can also look at lighting only, which is what I'm looking at right now, just to make this more obvious. So you can see that the shadows are being baked onto these objects, and it's not perfectly accurate. This is kind of a little bit messy. You know, you can see it trying to cast a shadow, but it's just so low resolution that it's difficult for it to get very much precision. Um, so that's how it looks at default. And every mesh that you put into Unreal has a default light map resolution of 64 by 64 pixels. For some objects, that's fine. For others, it's too little, and sometimes you need to increase it to get a better result. I think that if you're looking at these, if this was a regular game, I'd be pretty fine with this result. Like, those lighting artifacts are barely noticeable, you know, unless you fly right up to it, and they're being masked somewhat by the, you know, the color roughness, etc. So I don't think that's a big deal. But if you did think that was a big deal, you could go in and you could change the light map resolution. As soon as you check this box to override it, it gets unbuilt, and now we get the lighting needs to be rebuilt. So now it's being treated as a dynamic object, something to keep in mind. So let's say I'm turning it up to 256, which is ridiculously high for an object this small, but I'm doing it for the sake of the example. I'm going to build lighting real quick, and once it's built, I'm probably going to get probably still not great looking, but much more high-res shadows being cast around this area. So let's take a look at the lighting, and as you can see, yeah, now we're actually getting discrete shadows underneath each bolt. The weird artifacts around the bolt itself are not as noticeable, and overall it just looks quite a bit cleaner. Here's a negative effect, which is that this lip, which is very slight on the model, is now trying to cast its own shadow, but it's just too small and the resolution is still too low to really succeed at that. So this is something you would actually notice and think this is real bad. So I'd probably take this down to 128 just to make sure that lip doesn't try to cast that shadow, because it's not doing anybody any favors. So there we go. This is not nice, but, you know, in context, it's not as noticeable. For a game, that's probably okay. Yeah, so the lip shadow's gone. These look pretty decent. I think this is a fine result for this pipe. So the light map is stored on the mesh, and to do that, we need something called light map UVs. This is an important part. If you open a mesh in the static mesh editor in Unreal, which is this thing, you'll see over here a button called UV. And if you click it, you're going to get a menu. And if I go to UV channel 0, these are the UVs of this pipe. And they're spaced out because the other pipe meshes are using the same texture sheet. So they're all sort of sharing, you know, they're sort of sharing the same texture sheet. So each one has a different set of UVs, but they are all sort of meant to fit together. Anyway, so if you look at UV channel 0, that's what you get, the regular UVs that we're baking the texture, or we're putting the textures onto. If you look at UV channel 1, this is the light map UV, and Unreal created this UV map automatically. When you import a mesh into Unreal, it gives you a checkbox option called Generate Light Map UVs, and that's what it's doing. Is it's going to take the way it generates your light map UVs is that it's going to go and look in the UV channel 0, your main UV map. And it's going to take all these shells and try to pack them into a shape that it can use. And there's issues here. There's things you have to consider. So I decided to introduce two examples of how bad UV maps starting out can give you really bad light map UVs, and in turn really bad lighting. So I'm importing pipe bad A, and here we have it generating light map UVs, so it's going to do its best to use the UVs from the pipe to generate the light map UVs for this new pipe. So I'm going to go and make we can't use the texture anymore because this has new UVs, so I'm just going to make a simple white material for us to look at on the pipe. So just throw that on there. And now let's look at the UVs I made for the pipe. So this is what I did in Maya. I just planar mapped it. It's very bad. It's repulsive. I hate it. So let's look at the light map UV. Unreal did its best to split this apart and make it usable by the light maps. However, Unreal is not that smart, and it's still got these shells that are like overlapping themselves and like not straight on. They're warped and deformed. So let's try to throw this pipe in the world and see how it looks when we build lights on it. I guarantee you it's going to look really upsetting. And there it is. It looks better than I expected, to be honest, but if you look in here, it looks super nasty. You get an error message here. Pipe has overlapping UVs. Again, could be a lot worse, but it could be a lot better. So I'm actually going to show you a better example because that type of planar mapping, usually you can't get away with it in the way that I did here. It looks bad, but it doesn't look horrendous. So I made another one using this valve wheel model. And if we look at the original valve wheel, these are the UVs for it, and these are the light map UVs for it. They're pretty clean, as you can see. It's laid out pretty nice. Everything's flat and kind of easy to project light onto. If you look at this one, the UVs are this horrible planar projection, and if I go to the light map UVs, it's just a disaster. Like, what happened? I don't know. Unreal did its best to deal with this, and it did not succeed, I would say. So if I build the lights, you may have noticed the top and bottom of the wheel looked like they sort of got projected cleanly, but they were tiny, so you're going to get 4 pixels for that entire space. So let's see how this looks. Yeah, now we're getting some really bad results. This face has just stretching on it. Again, better than you would have expected probably, but like if I turn on lighting only, you'll see like this is all bad. This is all lighting just going horribly wrong. So this is why you need to provide Unreal with sort of reasonable UV maps. If you give it, if you give it something reasonable like this, it can do a pretty good job of converting it into a light map UV map. But if you give it just a mess, it's not going to be able to untangle that and just UV map your model for you. You really have to do most of the heavy lifting for Unreal. So there is another thing you want to avoid. So I'm going to bring in pipe bad B. And pipe bad B has kind of the opposite problem. Let me throw this material on there. And if you look at the UV channel, I did something really dumb, and all the faces around the outside of the pipe, I separated out. So they're all separate faces. They're all separate UV islands. So if we look at the UV map, or the light map UVs, they're all rendered out separately. And why is that bad? Well, I will show you. Let's throw this in the world and build it out. Bam. Okay, look at that. It's got seams because, while the model may have smoothing groups on it, oh my lord. Yeah, this is what you don't want to do. So while the model has smoothing groups on it, it doesn't, the light map that's stored in the texture can't really approximate those smoothing groups because it's just an image. It's just a shadow and light image. And what's particularly problematic here is that if you have a really low res light map, and if your UV shells in the light map UV are too close together, let's say this face here is in shadow and this one's in light. If it's low res enough, that is going to bleed across to the other shell. And that's, I think, what's happening here. You're getting the shadow ones are bleeding across into the light ones, and you're getting this awful ribbing effect. So there is one thing you can do to alleviate that. If you go to the general settings in the static mesh editor here, you'll see a setting called light map resolution. So first thing I can do is turn that up, and that will probably help. Let's take a look. It's unbuilt itself, as you can see, because whenever you change the light map resolution, it by necessity has to unbuild. All right, so that's better, but you can still see some problems. And those are never going to go away completely just because of how the light map UVs work. It's not going to be super good at approximating like smoothing groups. Like as you can see where it hits the sort of hard shadow, it's between two shells, the light map UV doesn't know how to deal with that. So that's why you do need to keep in mind when you're adding those seams, your normal map will cover them up. But if you're baking static lighting on a mesh, and your seams are in an area of sort of a strong light to dark or whatever, they may show up. So you do want to make sure on objects that are getting static light baked on them that you don't have really blatant seams. And that's a problem with any pipe mesh really, because you have to put the seam somewhere. Like this is my good example, and it's still got a seam here. So, if I was going to try to fix that, I'd probably rotate the pipe around so that the seam is facing the floor. That's sort of unavoidable, and it's just something to keep in mind. But when you're UVing, just try to do a good job, give Unreal a bunch of flat planes that are, easy for it to understand, and it will just lay them out for you into a light map UV. Okay, one last bit of unintuitive, confusing stuff for lighting. There is another behavior difference between stationary lights and static lights that you should know about. So this here is a stationary light. As you can see, it is casting light around here, and it's also influencing the normal maps here on the concrete. And if you go down, you can see that it's doing some nice specularity on this surface. If we go over to the static light, as you can see, it's not really lighting the normal maps very well. And it's also not providing any specularity. If we get down low like this, let me compare this more directly. Like look at that versus this. And the reason for that is that while the stationary light is sort of piped into Unreal's lighting engine in sort of a complicated way and telling sort of every part of Unreal's renderer that there's a light here, the static light is really kind of old school, and it really just paints light onto surfaces. So even though this floor is told that there's some light here, the game doesn't. The rest of the game doesn't know that, and it's not able to treat this surface as if there's sort of light shining over there. That's the best way I can explain it. So like this doesn't have a ton of bearing on how you would light a prop, right? But it does matter if you're going to be doing an entire environment later, because you might want to know, when do I use a movable light versus a stationary light versus a static light. What I would say is I like to mostly go with static lights because they give you kind of a wash of light, and it doesn't give you any fancy effects. But if you need a room to be just a little bit lighter, or you want sort of a certain area to be more of one color, it'll do that for you without any drama. If you have a stationary light, it's going to give you these hard edge shadows that might not look how you want. It's going to light everything up. It's going to reflect. Like this is another thing is maybe you just want this area to be lit up a little bit without seeing this big reflection, So the stationary lights are more dramatic, and I tend to use them for motivated light sources like a street light or something where you can clearly see where the light's coming from, a lamp, whatever. For sort of main hero lights, the stationary light is a good bet. And then the movable lights are good if you want them to move. I mean, that's the easy answer. For something you're just taking screenshots of, probably don't care about movable lights. But, they're good to keep in your back pocket, I guess. One final lighting thing to know about is lighting channels. So I'm going to demonstrate that here. If I click this light and I go to the light tab, I think by default this is closed up. So you got to go to the light tab on the details panel and open it up. Show advanced. And if I scroll down, you're going to see lighting channels, and you see channel 0, channel 1, and channel 2. And we only have channel 0 checked. That's the default. This light, same thing. Channel 0 is checked, 1 and 2 are not. If I go to this prop, it also has a lighting tab, and it also has lighting channels. So if I were to take this prop out of channel 0, it's now not really being lit by anything except for the skylight. If I put it back, it's back. So lighting channels are a way of saying, am I getting light from things in this channel? Yes, no. Or if you're a light, am I casting light into this channel? So by default, everything only looks at channel 0. But let's say I want this light. I'm going to make this light red for drama. Let's say I want this light to illuminate this valve, but I don't want it to cast any light on the ground. Maybe it's just sort of a dramatic light. Maybe it's a rim light or something, and I just don't want it to be spreading light all over the scene. It's just supposed to illuminate this one thing. So I'm going to take this light out of channel 0, and I'm going to put it into channel 1. Now it's doing nothing. But if I go to this valve, go to the lighting channels, and additionally, I'm not going to take it out of channel 0 because I still want it to accept light from sort of the world. But I'm also going to put it into channel 1. And now you can see it's getting light from this red light, and no matter what I do, the red light is not affecting anything else. And if I wanted to, put another pipe over here, it's not going to get any light from the red light unless I put it in channel 1, and now it does. So this is incredibly useful. I think for your props, if you're gonna be rendering them in Unreal, which you are, you can use this for a really good rim light effect. If I take this out of channel 0 and I put it into channel 1, I can point it at this valve, and I can just crank the intensity as high as I want for like a rim light effect, and I won't have to worry about any kind of blown out shadows or lighting on the ground. In fact, I'm going to turn it back. I'm going to put it back in channel 0 so you can see, like, that's what it would normally look like. But if you put it in a separate channel, you're going to get a rim light or whatever you want, and not have to worry about shadows. Alright, so that's everything you should know, and I just want to talk real quick about what I'm expecting for the sort of final glory shot renders from Unreal, and how you should be setting those up, because I want to emphasize now, I don't want to see like the default Unreal scene. I don't want to see the sky shader that they give you. I don't want to see any of that, any of those default levels. I want to see your own scene that you've made. By the way, if you want to make a new level, you right click in the content browser, you click level. And so let's start from basically nothing, actually. So this is an empty level, and as you've seen, I have a floor plane that I made, so you guys can make one of those, no problem. Put whatever kind of textures on it. Let me just throw a concrete on there like I had before. I'm going to pretend that this valve is my prop. So I'm going to put this in, and if I go to lit, unlike the default levels, it's pitch black because there's no light. So you can start out just putting a point light in there just so you can see. But at this point, it's really up to you how you want to set up your scene. Do you want to render it under sort of extreme conditions? If you think that would look good, then go for it. If you want to put a directional light in there and sort of light it under more naturalistic situation, That's also fine. You know, maybe, oops, maybe delete that. If you think that it's better without a ground plane and you just want to render it in empty space, that's okay. Really, this is where you guys can sort of bring in all your 3-point lighting expertise that you've learned at San Jose State University, and basically do whatever you want. You know, it would be lovely to see some, you know, some complementary colors with your lighting. I'm just doing dumb stuff right now, but you know, stuff like that. You can add a skylight for some fill. Actually, that won't work because it's not capturing anything because it's pitch black out here, but yeah, here's a visual effect. We looked at this before, but exponential height fog. You can throw that in your scene if you think that would look good. You can change the in-scattering color, is really just the color of the fog here. That's intense. You know, and you can bring down the intensity. That's also disgusting. But, you know, maybe just bring it down to something like that. And then throw a skylight in there to give you just a little bit of ambient light. Turn that up. Not working. Recapture. There we go. Yeah, so you have a lot of options, and I just want to see something lit nicely and something that you lit yourself that didn't, you know, didn't start as an epic scene. So I'm gonna do a second demo in a little bit where we talk about more sort of presentation tips and how to get this looking nice in Unreal. But for now, that's lighting. That's what I'm looking for, and I hope that helps. Again, this is really crazy stuff. So if you guys need help, that is absolutely fine. I would be astonished if everybody got this on the first try. So please get in touch if you need clarification on how some of this stuff works. Good luck. See you next time.